He looked into my eyes and said, "You don't have to be like this, I understand you, you are not alone." In that moment, I felt like all the pain of my uneventful marriage disappeared, as if he had found a way to ease the weight I had been carrying for years. Marcos, a 23-year-old, wasn't just a distraction. He made me feel something I had forgotten was possible. But I knew something was very wrong. He wasn't just a friend of my son's, he was the promise of something new. Something forbidden. And now, I wonder, how many of you have ever felt drawn to something you knew was wrong? But what felt so right at the time? Leave your opinion in the comments. Where are you watching? And subscribe for more stories like this. I found myself getting lost in his words and gestures, and soon I was at a point where I couldn't go back. All I wanted was to live that illusion for a few more minutes, maybe a few more hours. What I felt for Marcos wasn't just desire, it was something that fulfilled me in a way I had never imagined possible. Deep down, I knew I was moving away from reality. I had a husband, a son, a life, but Marcos made me forget all that. I tried to convince myself that it was no big deal. That what was happening between us was just innocent flirting, but with each encounter, the line between truth and lies became blurrier. The desire for him grew, and with it, the fear. The fear of being discovered, of destroying everything I had built over so many years. As time passed, Marcos became increasingly present in my thoughts. I could no longer focus on anything other than him. And the truth is, the more I gave in to him, the harder it became to go back. But the worst thing of all was that I knew this story could destroy my life. And yet, I didn't want to stop. Every encounter, every word exchanged made me want more. I was trapped in a dangerous game that consumed me, and I didn't know if I could escape. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you knew you were wrong but couldn't resist the temptation? What would you do? I was losing myself, and I knew it. Every time our eyes met, a flame lit up inside me. Marcos, in his early 20s, had this aura of freshness, of newness. He cared about me in a way that my husband no longer seemed able to do. I felt wanted, appreciated, and suddenly, that seemed more important than anything. In those moments when he was by my side, I felt like I was finally understood. He saw me, he noticed the details, and it made me forget everything that was at stake. As much as I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, something passing, I knew what was happening was deeper. Marcos wasn't just any young man, he was a secret that I tried to hide, but which, every day, became more impossible to control. I saw him, and he saw me in a way no one else did. This exchange of looks carried an emotional charge that I didn't know how to deal with. And the more he paid me attention, the more I felt obliged to reciprocate, to open up, to show him my fears, my most hidden desires. When we talked, he told me that he understood the difficulties I was facing, and I believed him. There was a sincerity in his eyes that, deep down, I knew was true. I saw him as someone who understood me in a way no one else ever could. He told me that I deserved more than I was living, and with each word, I felt more attracted to him. Marcos was feeding something inside me, and I didn't know if I wanted to resist or give in completely to it. I knew I was being deceived, that he wasn't really interested in me in a pure way, but I let myself go. The desire spoke louder, and I could no longer control my feelings. Something inside me screamed for me to stop before it was too late, but the need to be loved, to be seen, was consuming me. Every message we exchanged, every secret meeting, made the situation more difficult to reverse. I was in a web of lies, and I didn't know how to get out of it without losing everything. The tension between us was growing. I could feel the change in the air, every time we saw each other, every time we exchanged words. When he touched me, it was like I was being touched for the first time in a real way, something I had never experienced. The simple touch of your hand on mine made my body react. And my mind could no longer deal with what was happening. He always said he understood me, that he knew how difficult things were for me. And with each conversation, I started to believe him more and more. What started out as something harmless, a seemingly casual friendship, was becoming something much more complicated. Every encounter I had with him made me want more. I could no longer imagine myself without the conversations, without his attention. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind, the voice of reason was trying to scream at me to stop. I had a family, a husband, a son. And at the same time, I couldn't help but think about everything I would lose. But when I looked at Marcos, life seemed easier. It gave me a feeling of relief, of freshness, something I hadn't felt in years. How could I let this go? Every time he told me that I wasn't alone, that he was there for me, my heart raced. He wasn't just saying it to be nice, he actually believed it. He was trying to convince me that I deserved more than I got. And I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that he was the key to the happiness I sought. I wondered, was he just playing me? Did he know what he was doing? Or was he also getting carried away by this dangerous game? And worst of all, I didn't know if I cared. The consequences, the guilt, the possible consequences of the discovery, they seemed distant, almost unreal. When he was by my side. Every day, the line between what I knew was right and what I was doing became more blurred. I tried to justify my feelings to myself, saying he was just listening to me, that he was just being kind, but deep down, I knew the truth. Marcos was not just a friend. He was the outlet for something I felt was missing in my life. I looked at my husband, and he seemed so distant, so oblivious. I wondered if he already knew, or if he even cared. But when he looked at Marcos, all he saw was genuine attention. He saw me. He understood the loneliness I carried in my chest, and that attracted me more than anything. Every time our eyes met, I felt like he knew what I was thinking, like he knew I was losing myself in him. As much as I tried to rationalize and convince myself that it was just a temporary mistake, something in me didn't want to stop. I liked what he gave me. The feeling of being desired, of being seen with different eyes. With each meeting, each exchange of messages, each touch, I felt more involved, more trapped in this web I was weaving. There was no turning back. I knew I was fooling everyone. To my husband, my son, but, most importantly, to myself. I convinced myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong, but deep down, I felt the weight of guilt crushing me. However, when I was with Marcos, that weight disappeared. He made me feel alive again. And as much as I tried to resist, the truth was that I didn't want to let it go. I didn't want the fantasy to end. The fear of being discovered began to consume me. I knew that when my son or my husband found out, the truth would come out and everything would fall apart. But for some reason the risk seemed to become more exciting. More desirable. Every encounter with Marcos was like an escape, and I was starting to not care what would happen when this all came out. I was at a point of no return, I knew that. The game I was playing with Marcos was no longer about pleasure or seeking attention, but about power. I was beginning to realize that he was also giving in to a dynamic that could destroy everything. And, paradoxically, I didn't want it to end. The risk attracted me like a burning flame, and I couldn't shake the idea that, perhaps, this was what I deserved. In my conversations with him, I began to notice how he manipulated me in subtle ways, how he strategically positioned himself to make me feel like I was in control, when in reality, he was the one who guided everything. He told me that it was difficult to understand my marriage, that I deserved to be happier, that I deserved someone who made me feel truly alive. His every word stuck in my heart, as if he knew what I needed to hear, as if he had the right words to take me out of this tepid and boring life. As the days passed, I found myself less willing to turn back. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but at the same time, there was something in me that I no longer wanted to change. I was so involved in it that I stopped wondering if Marcos was being sincere or just playing a dirty game. What mattered was that he was giving me what I was missing, and, more than that, he was giving me the feeling of being wanted and unique. He made me believe that I mattered to him in a way that no one else did. When I started to realize everything I could lose, a disturbing thought crept in: would it really be so bad to lose everything? Was I really willing to destroy my family for a moment of pleasure and excitement? Or was it simply the feeling of power, of control over the situation, that kept me playing this dangerous game? The biggest fear I had, however, was losing Marcos. I no longer knew if I wanted him because of what he represented to me or because of the game I was playing. The desire to have everything, to be loved and desired, to control, was already taking over my life in a way that I no longer knew how to control. I felt like I was on the edge, almost at the point of no return. I began to see myself reflected in Marcos in a way I never imagined. He seemed so immersed in what we were creating, in our own bubble, that I barely realized how much we were playing with fire. Sometimes I felt like he was starting to have more power over me than I had over him. And that feeling scared me in a way I couldn't ignore. But at the same time, there was a part of me that liked that feeling. He saw me as I wanted to be seen, not just as the woman tired of a dull marriage, but as someone with value, someone he wanted to be with. It gave me a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, he showed up at my house without warning. My heart skipped a beat as soon as I saw him at the door. My husband was at work, my son was also away for an appointment, and there we were, alone. He entered without saying anything, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. What disturbed me most was his look, that look full of promises and secrets. He knew I was getting closer to the edge, and I knew he felt it too. What we were doing was almost like an experiment, an exploration of something new. But the truth was that we could no longer distinguish where the pleasure ended and the error began. "Are you okay?" he asked, and the way he looked at me made my stomach drop. I knew what he meant. I knew he was touching on something deeper, something that was becoming more and more real to me. I shook my head, trying to hide the tension I felt. But at the same time, a growing desire inside me wanted him to come closer, wanted him not to ask questions, just act. I don't know if I'm okay," I replied, my voice wavering. He smiled softly, almost as if he knew what was going through my mind. And said nothing more. He just pulled me closer. And, at that moment, I realized that I was completely surrendered to the game we had started, the game that, at some point, we would lose control of. There was no turning back. Everything was about to fall apart, and I could feel it deep in my soul. But for a moment, that sense of danger was too exciting to pass by. The risk was what made it all so addictive. And, no matter how much reason tried to speak louder, I could no longer hear it. Time passed in a frantic sequence of secret meetings, disguised messages, and furtive glances. I started to lose myself in this whirlwind of emotions, and it felt like my life had turned into a well-rehearsed lie. More and more, I asked myself why I was doing this. I loved my husband, or at least I believed I did. But Marcos, he was giving me something I didn't know I was missing. He made me feel special, wanted, and it became an addiction that I couldn't kick. There was something about the way he looked at me that made my heart skip a beat. Every touch, every word he said to me, seemed to cut the distance between us, breaking all the barriers I've built over the years. I felt like I was being reborn, like I was the woman I always wanted to be. But I also knew that this new me was built on lies and deceit. And that made me more and more anxious. My husband began to notice that something was different. He was no fool, and his increasingly insistent questions made me feel increasing pressure. He didn't know what was going on, but he was beginning to suspect me. Something in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. And that terrified me. One afternoon, when he questioned me about my strange behavior, I knew the truth was about to be discovered. I was evasive, trying to divert the conversation, but he didn't give up. I was lost in my own lies, and the words I wanted to say stuck in my throat. The confrontation was imminent. But while that didn't happen, I continued to lose myself more in Marcos. He still called me, sent me messages, and every moment we spent together, I felt more involved, more distant from reality. I knew I needed to make a decision, but the idea of losing everything I was building left me paralyzed. I was at a dead end, and deep down, I knew my life would never be the same. That night, everything became clearer. I knew I couldn't continue like this, but at the same time, the idea of losing everything I was building with Marcos left me completely confused. I loved my husband, but he no longer looked at me the same way. Marcos, on the other hand, saw me with different eyes. With an admiration that I no longer knew existed for me. I was caught up in a game that I no longer knew how to control, but every time I felt it close, with every touch, I found myself more and more involved. The dilemma began to eat away at me inside. I knew that by going along with this secret, I was digging my own hole. What if my son found out? What if my husband really knew everything? I didn't know how to face the consequences, but at the same time, I couldn't give up on what I was feeling. Marcos seemed increasingly determined to seduce me, to involve me. He came to my house more often, and the excitement of seeing him, knowing that no one else knew what was happening, made everything even more intense. There was something about the way he acted, his posture, that made me feel like he was controlling me, like he was the only one who really understood who I was. I knew he was manipulating me, but I didn't want to admit it. It felt so good to feel. If so, desired, live. When he told me, with that smile I knew so well, "You don't have to hide anything from me anymore. I know what you need," something in me broke. He was right. I was no longer hiding anything. He had become the center of my world, and I accepted him. I knew my marriage was slowly disintegrating, but what I feared most was not losing my husband, but losing the feeling of being seen, of being loved in a unique way. I didn't want to lose that, even though I knew I was wrong. That night my heart was in pieces. But something inside me still refused to let Marcos go. The fear of losing this part of me, of losing this life I was creating, was taking over everything. I knew I could no longer postpone the confrontation. It was clear to me that at any moment the truth would come out. I was trying to fool myself that I could keep this relationship a secret, but the pressure of living two different lives was consuming me. On the one hand, there was the everyday Cecilia, the dedicated wife, the present mother. But on the other, I was someone completely different, with desires and feelings I had never known before. Marcos showed me a version of myself that I feared, but at the same time, I was enchanted by. That afternoon was the breaking point. I was at home, alone, waiting for Marcos, when my son, Daniel, arrived unexpectedly. He looked tense, with something heavy in his eyes. I knew something wasn't right. He stood in the doorway, watching me with a look I couldn't decipher, until he finally asked, "Mom, what's going on? You've been acting strange lately. Is something going on that I don't know about?" I froze, fear taking over me. The words I most feared hearing were finally coming out of his mouth. But how could I explain? How could she say that she was in love with a young man who wasn't her father? That I was in a relationship that destroyed everything I had built over the years? I knew the response would be devastation. But he already knew something. His look told me that. "Mom, you're lying to me, aren't you?" Daniel insisted, taking a step forward. He seemed to be getting closer to the truth, and that terrified me. I wanted to disappear, I wanted to run away from there, but I knew I couldn't. That's when the doorbell rang. I knew who it was. The knock on the door echoed in my head like an omen. There was no turning back. I had lost control. When I opened the door, Marcos was there, with that smile on his face, as if nothing was happening. But Daniel's gaze passed from me to him, and an uncomfortable tension filled the air. What would happen now? We were all on the edge of an abyss, and the only thing I knew was that, somehow, my life would never be the same again. The air became heavy, and the silence between the three of us was deafening. Daniel looked at me, not saying a word, but his eyes were full of questions and accusations. Marcos, in turn, seemed disconcerted, but didn't show the concern I felt. He was calm, as if he was in control of the entire situation. I didn't know how to face it. The weight of guilt crushed me, but the feeling of being between two worlds, two conflicting loves, was even more intense. How had I gotten to this point? I need to talk to you, Mom, Daniel said finally, his voice tense. I knew he already knew. But how could I explain? How to justify the unjustifiable. I looked at Marcos for help, but he just stepped back, letting me deal with the problem I had created. I felt a mixture of anger and despair. He was leaving me alone. Daniel, please, it's not what you think, I tried to say. But my voice sounded weak, without conviction. I didn't know what to say. How could I deny the obvious? He knew. What he didn't know was the extent of what was happening. He didn't know about the involvement, the intensity of the feelings, the lie I was living. So what is it, Mom? What exactly is going on? He interrupted me. His eyes now harder, more critical. The shock of seeing him like this made me shudder. He was hurt, and it cut like a knife. I wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. I felt like I was on the verge of breaking down, the weight of the lie bearing down on me, the pain of having deceived the person I loved most, my own son. But what confused me most was the fact that, somewhere deep down, I also wanted that. I wanted Marcos, I wanted the life he offered me. And I no longer knew if this was just an escape from reality or a part of myself that I had never allowed to see. The truth was about to come out. There was no more hiding it. And at that moment, I realized that no matter what happened, my life would never be the same. I was on the verge of losing everything.